Hello everyone, welcome to our audiobook channel. If you enjoy this story or want to hear more exciting content, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Your feedback helps us improve and bring even more captivating stories. Enjoy listening. Chapter 1, Prologue. #Prologue #. When I opened my eyes, I was inside a novel. The Birth of a Hero. The Birth of a Hero was a novel focused on the adventures of the main character, Choi Han, a high school boy who was transported to a different dimension from Earth, along with the birth of the numerous heroes of the continent. I became a part of that novel as the trash of the Count's family, the family that oversaw the territory where the first village that Choi Han visits is located. The problem is that Choi Han becomes twisted after that village, and everyone in it, are destroyed by assassins. The bigger problem is the fact that this stupid trash who I become doesn't know about what happened in the village and messes with Choi Han, only to get beaten to a pulp. This is going to be a problem. I feel like something serious has happened to me. But it was worth trying to make this my new life. Zem on 1. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 2, When I Opened My Eyes. 1. The man could feel someone gently tapping his body. The rough hand made the man think of the hands of an exhausted parent. It was that warm. "Young master, it is morning." But the voice was very profound. The man felt chills throughout his body and his eyes subconsciously opened. Rather than the bright sunlight coming in through the window to warm the man's eyes, what he saw was an old man standing there with a satisfied expression. "It is surprising to see you wake up after a single attempt." "Huh. The master wishes to dine with the young master since it has been a while. It looks like it will be possible today." The man could see a mirror past the old man's shoulder. Inside the mirror was a red-haired man who seemed to be confused looking back at him. "I guess that guy is me. Young Master Cale." The man turned toward the source of the worried voice to find the old man, who looked like a servant, looking toward him. But that concerned man was not the problem. The man clearly heard it. Young Master Cale. It was a familiar name. He slowly blurted out the name. Cale Henituse. The old servant was looking at him like he was looking at his own grandson. "Yes. That is your name, young master. I'm guessing you are still a bit drunk." Listening to the concerned response of the old man, the man naturally thought about a name that was even more important than the name Cale Henituse. "B. Crocs. Are you talking about my son?" "Chef." "Yes. My son is the chef. Do you need him to make something for your hangover?" The man felt his surroundings turn dark and he started to feel dizzy. He lowered his head and put it into his hand. "Young master, are you still drunk? Should I call the doctor? Or will you wash right now?" The man looked at the red hair that was falling in front of his face. It was a bright red color, much too different from his original black hair. Cale Henituse. B. Crocs. B. Crocs's dad, Ron. They were the characters that appeared at the beginning of The Birth of a Hero, the novel the man was reading before he fell asleep last night. He jerked his head up and looked around. He could see the bedroom that was completely different from a typical Korean design. It made the man think about Europe. Every single thing in the room was extremely extravagant and luxurious. "Young master." The man responded to Ron, the old man who was pretending to be concerned and worried. "Cold water." "Excuse me." He needed something to clear his mind. He could see the face of Cale Henituse in the mirror behind old man Ron. Still looks normal. I guess Cale hasn't been beaten to a pulp by the main character just yet. His handsome face caught his attention. The man had become Cale Henituse when he opened his eyes. Cale Henituse. The trash who was beaten to a pulp by the main character in the beginning of The Birth of a Hero. That was who he was. "Young master, I presume you will not be bathing in cold water. Are you asking for drinking water? Cale turned his gaze toward Ron. Ron may be pretending to be a benign old man, but he was actually hiding his true identity as a cruel and vicious individual. He made the request to Ron. Please get me some drinking water. He needed to drink some cold water and clear his mind first. I will prepare it right away. Great. Thanks. Ron flinched for a second and had an odd expression on his face, but Cale did not notice it. Ron had to leave the bedroom as there was only warm water in the room. Once he was left alone, Cale got off the bed and headed to the bathroom. If he really was inside of the novel, he knew that there should be a large mirror inside. As expected, the full-body mirror was inside the bathroom. Cale Henituse, who had a lot of interest in his appearance and physique, had this mirror set up in here. Nobody else in the household had such a mirror. The man in the mirror had red hair and a pretty fit body. It wouldn't be wrong to say he had a body that would make any style look good. I really am Cale. The man in the mirror indeed was Cale Henituse from the novel. The Birth of a Hero was very descriptive about each of the characters' appearance. That was why the man had no choice but to agree that he had indeed turned into Cale Henituse. Do people usually become calmer when they are surprised and shocked? Cale, no, Kim Rock-soo, calmly thought about the night before. It was a typical day off. It had been a while since he had read an actual book instead of on his phone, so he went to the library to check out some books. He borrowed the entire series since he planned to read all day long. The name of that book was, of course, The Birth of a Hero. He managed to finish the 5th volume before he fell asleep. But when he woke up, he had turned into Cale Henituse, the individual that the main character mercilessly beat up in Volume 1. Will things go the way they did in the novel? He felt unnaturally calm. Once he got past the point of shock, his mind had calmed back down. He started to remember the contents of Volume 1. The Birth of a Hero. This novel was about the birth of the heroes in the Western and Eastern continents, as well as their trials and growth. The main character was, naturally, Korean. He was a student who had been transported into the world when he was a freshman in high school. Furthermore, his lifespan became as long as a dragon's lifespan, making him pretty much never age. This is bad. He was going to be beaten into a pulp by such a person. The important thing, however, was that he had not been beaten up just yet. Cale took his eyes off the mirror and walked into the tub that was full of warm water. He leaned against the tub and looked up at the ceiling. It was that expensive marble that was described in the novel. The estate that Cale lived in was actually full of marble. Cale started to mumble as he looked toward the ceiling. It's not like there's much I'll miss. His life as Kim Rock-soo. There really wasn't much to it. He was an orphan and didn't have much money. He also didn't have a person he loved to death, nor a friend he would give his life to save. He only continued to live because he could not die. Yes, he could not die. He completely hated the thought of death or pain. He became an orphan after both of his parents passed away from a car accident when he was little. He didn't like pain or death. No matter what it was, even if he was rolling in a pile of dog shit, it was still better than being dead. For that reason, I need to first make sure I don't get beaten up. Cale did not know what day it was in the novel right now, but he was sure that he had not met with the main character just yet. The reason was simple. I don't have the scar on my side. Cale Henituse, the trash of Count Henituse's family. A few days before meeting the main character, Cale was drinking and causing a ruckus. He was flinging things around and got stabbed on his side by a broken desk leg, resulting in the scar. What an interesting character. He didn't get the scar from fighting someone else. He got it because he got angry that the alcohol didn't taste good and threw a tantrum. He meets the main character after he gets the scar, and, after a short discussion, he gets beaten to a pulp. Cale crossed his arms and started to think. He did not know what happened to Cale after getting beaten to a pulp in Volume 1. All he knew was that the main character, Choi Han, has many fateful encounters and overcomes a lot of trials to grow into a hero along with his party members. Thus the era for him to prove that he is a hero will begin. The Roan kingdom that Cale currently lives in, as well as many other locations in the eastern and western continents, will be filled with war. It truly will turn into the time for the heroes to show their full potential. Cale started to frown. Kim Rok-soo, the man who became Cale. His life motto was pretty simple. Living long without pain. Enjoying the small joys of life. Living a peaceful life. As long as I make the story proceed like normal while taking out the fact that I get beaten up, the main character will take care of the rest. For some odd reason, he could recall every single line in the book without any issue. Cale relaxed in the warm water while coming to a final conclusion with his now clear head. It's worth trying. It was worth trying to avoid the continent's war and living peacefully. This trashy situation was much better than when he was Kim Rok-soo. The location of this estate was also in the corner of the western continent, making it an ideal location to avoid the war. In the novel itself, there were many nobles who managed to avoid the influences of war. Even if he could not completely avoid it, he should be able to at least reduce the damages to a minimum. "Young master, are you inside the bathroom?" He could hear Ron's voice coming from outside. Cale thought about Ron's true identity. Ron was an assassin who crossed over from the eastern continent by sea. He pretended to be a benign old man, but the true Ron was a cruel and merciless man. "Yes. I'll be right out." His natural response was to talk informally to the old man. Cale realized what he was doing and made up his mind about what to do in the future. He needed to push that old man to the main character and send him away. That old man could easily kill Cale with a single blow but treated Cale like a puppy you left alone because you felt bad for it. He was smiling gently, but there was not an ounce of care about Cale on the inside. In the novel, Ron leaves with the main character and his son after Choi Han beats Cale to a pulp. Cale put the bathrobe on as he quickly exited the bathroom. Ron was standing there with a smile on his face and a tray with a cup in his hands. "Young master, here you go." Cale picked up the cup and walked past the old man. He did not want to make eye contact with such a dangerous old man. "Great, thanks." Ron's expression turned odd once again, but Cale had already walked past him. Cale took a drink of the cold water as he started to think. There are too many strong people here. In fact, there were too many of them. No matter where the main character went, there were either strong individuals or individuals with hidden secrets. These individuals were both human and other races. I at least need the strength to protect myself. In order to live long without pain in the continent that will soon be filled with war, you needed a decent level of strength. Of course, you could not be too strong. Then other complicated things will happen. Cale thought about the different fateful encounters that occurred in the beginning parts of the novel. The powers that strengthen the main character and his party members. He was thinking about the ones that would help him live long without pain. There were a couple that came to mind. He just needed to pick one of them. "Young master, we will start to dress you now." "Oh, right. Thanks." The door soon opened and couple servants entered to help Ron dress Cale. Cale did not notice that Ron had a stoic expression unlike his usual self as he looked at the clothes the servants were bringing in. Ah, something simple today. He hated really complicated attires. Simple clothes that let you relax comfortably were the best. "Yes, young master." The servant in charge of the attires quickly pulled out some simple clothes and Cale changed into the simplest of them all. He lightly frowned after finishing getting dressed. Even this, simple, attire was extremely extravagant and not to his liking. However, the reflection in the mirror was quite handsome. He really is handsome and makes any clothes look good. The face really was the final piece to fashion. He looked in the mirror and fixed his sleeves before turning around to look at Ron. Ron was once again smiling like a gentle old man. "Ron, let's go." Cale walked behind Ron. It was nice that he did not need to know the layout of the estate. He just needed to follow Ron wherever he needed to go. All of the servants that Cale saw flinched and bowed respectfully before they seemed to run away. Why are they so scared? Cale never hit people. He just liked to drink and play. Sometimes, when he was drunk, he did break things. But that was why he was the trash of the family. He also did not treat people like people, other than the few people he liked. Well, it's better if nobody talks to me. Cale thought about it peacefully. It would be more difficult if he was in the body of a model citizen. A trash can do as they please without worry. It was only possible because there was no desire to live as a model citizen. I will now open the door. Sure. Cale nodded his head toward Ron. The book mentioned that Cale treated Ron, someone who raised him like he was his own grandson since he was little, as nicely as he treated his own father. It mentioned that he always responded to Ron and treated him like a person. Of course, Ron did not really think that way. That was why it was easy for Cale to talk to Ron. He just needed to answer Ron's questions and treat him like a human being. I hope you enjoy your breakfast. Thanks. Ron, make sure you eat a good meal too. Cale walked past Ron and into the dining room. He could see his family sitting there. His father and the current head of the Henituse household, Ruth. Next to him was Cale's stepmother, the Countess, as well as her son and daughter. The four people looked toward Cale. You are late again, today. Cale's gaze turned toward his father who spoke. The birth of a hero described Cale's feelings for his father like this. His father was the one person that Cale listened to. The reason the trash did not leave the area and got everything he wanted inside the Count's territory was because of his father, Count Henituse. But, unfortunately, Cale's father was unlike the other strong fathers in this novel. He did not have any special skills or influence. He just had a lot of money. However, Cale liked this a lot. It was the perfect family environment to live a simple life. Then there were the other three individuals. His stepmother who knew that he did not like her and avoided him. Her smart firstborn who found it difficult to deal with his much older brother Cale. And the cute youngest of the family who avoided her older brother Cale. But it wasn't like Cale bothered them or they bothered Cale. They just treated each other like strangers. Cale thought this was such a great environment to quietly live alone. Take a seat. Yes, father. Cale looked at the feast on the table that did not meet his definition of breakfast and sat down on his seat. He then felt something was odd and lifted his head up. Is there something you need to say, father? No, I do not. Ruth was staring at Cale. The rest of the family was doing the same. Cale made eye contact with each of these family members. They all quickly turned away whenever he made eye contact and continued to eat. I guess they find me really difficult to handle. Cale turned his head toward the table as well. This luxurious feast that was different than the breakfast he used to eat just to fill his belly made him start to smile. He first started by cutting the sausage in half with the knife. It is so juicy. He didn't know if juice flowed out as soon as he cut into it because it was handmade or because it was cooked well, but the color on the sausage made him hungry. Cale started to smile without realizing it. Clang. He heard something fall down and made eye contact with his younger brother Basin. He could see that Basin had dropped the fork in his hand. My apologies. Basin calmly apologized like the personality described for him in the novel. The servant in charge of the meal quickly came over to hand Basin a new fork and picked up the fork on the floor. Watching that made Cale think that it was nice to be a noble before he focused once again on the food in front of him. Cale had found the first good thing about coming into the novel. This breakfast was extremely luxurious and so tasty that his stomach was completely happy. The smile on his face could not disappear. Ho! That was why he did not hear his brother Basin's shocked proclamation. Chapter 3, When I Opened My Eyes, 2. Cale looked around at all of the dishes in front of him. He then moved his fork towards a salad made of fruits that he did not recognize. After filling his stomach with meat, soup, and bread, he wanted to try something new. The fruit looked like an orange, but the color was closer to that of grapes. Cale put the fruit in his mouth and took a bite. In that instant, sweet fruit juice filled his mouth. He really hated sour fruits, so this extremely sweet flavor in his mouth made him subconsciously start to drool. At that moment, he made eye contact with his father Deruth, who was looking at him. Cale. Deruth quietly called Cale's name before hesitating. He then started to frown and move his mouth. Cale did not like that awkward atmosphere and started to speak. It's delicious. Yes, it tastes like trash, huh? Did you say it is delicious? Yes. Everything tastes wonderful. Cale picked up a different fruit this time and smiled after tasting the sweetness in his mouth once again. The trash, Cale Henituse, never cared for etiquette anyways. He probably shouldn't do this while speaking with his father, the head of the household, but whatever. He's just trash in the first place. It really is best to be the trash. Nobody really cared no matter what he did. As long as he can prevent himself from getting beaten up by the main character, it will be a good life. As Cale expected, nobody criticized his lack of manners. In fact, Deruth actually had a smile on his face as he started to nod his head. Yes, it really is delicious. It is nice to see you enjoying food so much. Deruth really seemed like the only person who cared for Cale. He didn't even seem to care about Cale's lack of manners. Well, a truly caring father should probably try to fix this personality of Cale, but this Cale did not care as he was not the real Cale Henituse. Yes. Please make sure you eat a lot as well, father. Basin let out another, ho, and Cale, who heard it this time, turned his gaze back to the dishes. The 15-year-old Basin. The 3 years younger brother of the Cale that he possessed was difficult to handle. Unlike the trash Cale, Basin was smart, sincere, and very responsible. The people of the family were pushing for Basin to be the next head of household. Kim Rock-soo agreed with this sentiment even after turning into Cale. Rather than having a complicated life being in charge of this territory, I'd rather use my position as the Count's older brother to laze around and live peacefully in a section of the territory. Cale did not try to argue with Basin. He could hear Basin's gasp of shock and knew that Basin was looking down on him, but what could he do about it? Once Basin becomes the head of the household, his personality was one that he would probably not kill Cale, but in order to not get hurt and quietly move to a small village, he needed to not get on Basin's nerves. If that's not possible, I'll just make some money beforehand and go somewhere that the war will not reach. Cale pretended not to hear Basin's gasp and continued to eat. Once the meal was over, his father, Deruth, was the first to get up. He seemed to have been satisfied with breakfast, as his face was filled with a smile. It really was delicious. If breakfast was like this every day, Cale would probably give up some sleep to come eat breakfast all the time. Deruth looked around at the family members who got up after he did, before resting his gaze on his firstborn son, Cale. Cale, is there anything you need? Cale was confused at Deruth's sudden gesture, but he decided to honestly answer. Please give me some money. Sure, I'll give you a lot. Deruth answered without any hesitation. This really was a well-off family. As a territory that mined for marble and grew grapes for wine, they were overflowing with money right now. Great. Please give me as much as you can. Cale could feel his 2 younger siblings looking at him, but there was no need for him to be embarrassed. Wasn't it better to ask for money instead of drinking and causing a ruckus? Furthermore, he needed money to proceed with his plans. That fateful encounter to get himself a strong enough power to keep himself safe. He needed some money in order to cause that fateful encounter to happen. Sure. I'll give you as much as I can. Cale started to smile after being satisfied with his father's response. However, he was at a loss of words after returning to his chamber and receiving the check from the deputy butler, Hans. The check that was issued through a partnership with the Treasury Department and the Magic Department made Cale's heart run wild. So much money. This family didn't seem to only have a bit of money. In fact, they seemed to have a lot of money. The novel did mention that Cale received a large allowance, but it did not mention the exact amount. However, he could realistically understand how large it was based on the amount listed on the check. 10 million gallon. It is about equivalent to 10 million Korean won. If it is like this, Cale could change his plans. Cale's brain started to quickly think about his options. I'll be heading out now, young master. The deputy butler delivered the check and bid goodbye, but Cale did not respond. Deputy butler Hans just treated this as normal and headed toward the door. However, he soon stopped moving. It was because Cale had gotten up from his seat and said something to Ron. Ron, let's go to the study. Hans then became anxious at Cale's words. Ron was the same. Did you say the study? Cale found this odd. This sly old man's voice was shaking a bit. Was there a reason he could not go to the study? Yes. He needed to go to the study to form his plan. There were no desks or even any paper in his chamber. There were a lot of expensive-looking alcohol bottles though. Excuse me, young master. What is it? Cale looked toward the anxious-looking deputy butler. We have not been able to do our morning cleaning of the study just yet. Is that so? It's fine if it goes a day without cleaning. No sir. We cannot let that happen. The deputy butler was extremely pushy about this for some reason. He then smiled brightly and put up a single finger. Please just wait 1 hour. I will put my name on the line to make sure that the study is completely clean, not like a study that has not been used in 10 years, but one that was used just yesterday. Sure, whatever. He didn't mind waiting an hour. Great. Then I will go report this to the master. No need to do that, but go ahead if you want to do so. Yes, young master. I will be off now. Okay. Sure. Like a well-trained deputy butler, Hans closed the door without making any noise and disappeared. He seemed to be in a rush. Cale knew that there were 3 deputy butlers vying to become the official butler. Maybe that was why Hans was so passionate about it? Ron. Why are you blanking out like that? My apologies, young master. No need to apologize. Ron had another odd expression on his face, but Cale put the precious check in his inner pocket as he asked. There was so much going on that he did not even have any time to ask about today's date. What is today's date? This question would seem odd coming from anybody else, but the servant Ron answered in a gentle voice. It is the 29th day of the 3rd month in the 781st year of the Felix calendar. That is a problem. Nothing. Cale tightly clenched on the 10 million gallon in his pocket once more. The only thing he could trust was money. Yesterday, the 28th day of the 3rd month in the 781st year of the Felix calendar. That was the day that the villagers of Harris village, the village that the main character Choi Han went to after escaping from the Forest of Darkness, the place that Choi Han felt human affection for the first time in this world, made friends, and created a second family, were all murdered by an unknown group of assassins. Even Cale, who had read until the 5th volume, did not know the true identity of this secret organization that murdered the villagers. Some readers may be saying something like this while reading about this situation. I thought he was really strong. What was Choi Han doing while they were murdered? It is only natural to think like that. However, there is a reason this novel is called The Birth of a Hero, and not The Strength of the Hero, or The War of the Heroes. Birth. It was the story of a person who overcame all sorts of obstacles and carried the pains of his past as he became a hero. Love and friendship comes up along the way as he meets enemies and friends. Something that cannot be missing from a story is the awakening. He may have explosive talents and have lived for tens of years in the forest of darkness, but, through all of that, Choi Han was still an innocent and gentle person who could not kill another human being. He had no issues killing monsters, but Choi Han had never hurt another person. In order to turn someone like him into a hero, the novel had created a situation for Choi Han. In order to heal the lady who treated him like her own son, Choi Han had gone into the forest of darkness to find some precious medicinal herbs. He had to travel deep into the forest to find it, and, when he finally managed to find the herb and headed back towards the village, he found the corpses of the murdered villagers, the burning houses, and the assassins who were about to leave. Choi Han went berserk after seeing this and killed someone for the first time. Of course, the people he killed are the members of this secret organization, and this secret organization clashes against Choi Han every so often throughout the novel. Choi Han only returns to normal after killing all of the assassins from the secret organization, before falling into a state of despair as he is unable to gather any information from the dead bodies. He then buries the bodies of the villagers before making a promise to himself. I will kill them all. I will kill all of the people that made this happen. Choi Han realized what the sadness of death was at this moment, but his first kill starts to twist his mind. Of course, he starts to feel again and starts to become more human-like after meeting his party members later in the novel, and grows to become a true hero. Ron. A cup of cold water please. I understand. After Ron left and he was alone in the room, Cale covered his face with both of his hands. The problem was that the city that this twisted Choi Han arrives at after leaving Harris village is the city called Western, located in the center of the Henituse territory. Cale, who happens to run into Choi Han, annoys Choi Han and ends up getting beaten up. That is when Choi Han gets his first subject/party member, the reliable Chef B. Crocs. I was going to head there in advance and help him out. The best scenario to not get beaten up is no longer available. I did care more about potentially saving the people of the village, but there is nothing I can do about it at this point. Now, all that is left is to make sure I act in a way to avoid getting beaten up by the angry Choi Han, who is moving at a crazy speed to arrive at Western City by tomorrow. Avoiding the main character is not a good idea. He needed to run into Choi Han so that Ron and B. Crocs run into him as well. That was the only way for the three of them to leave this place together to start their official journey. Then that left just one course of action. Have them run into each other and then get out of their way. With the best possible first impression, if possible. Young master. Ah, thanks, Ron. Cale took a sip from the cup that Ron brought over. He then started to frown. It's not cold water. It is lemonade. He really is an insidious man. He knows that, just like Kim Rock-soo, the original Cale hates sour things. But he still chose to bring lemonade, which would take more work to prepare than cold water. Cale wanted to be angry at the sour taste, but he could not do so because he was afraid of that assassin old man. He could only drink the lemonade. Thanks, it was wonderful. No problem. Young master. We should be able to head to the study soon. Great. Ron's benign and gentle smile caused Cale to have the chills. He once again clenched onto the 10 million gallon check for support. Money really was the only thing you could trust. Chapter 4, They Met, 1. He could not think about anything else while food was in front of him. He could not even prevent the admiration that was flowing out of his mouth. Ha! It's so delicious. The deputy butler Hans flinched at the words that came out of Cale's mouth. Cale was sitting alone at the table, with Hans standing next to him. Other than breakfast, Count Henituse's family tended to take care of the other meals freely. To be honest, it was mainly because they each had their own responsibilities. Nobody said that it was easy to be a noble. Especially if you were in administration or politics, you had to follow a strict schedule, dropping everything else if you received an order from someone above you. Count de Ruth had responsibilities as the lord of the region, making it difficult to share other meals together, while Cale's younger siblings timed their meals based on their studies. The Countess was busy interacting with the wives of the influential households in the region, as well as other tasks. Now that I think about it. Cale put the fork down after suddenly remembering something. Hans started to get nervous, thinking to himself that this was the normal Cale. He was worried because he did not know when that fork may fly toward his face. Cale did not care whether Hans was nervous or not as he got lost in his own thoughts. There are a lot of experts hiding as artists or craftsmen. The Rhone kingdom was pretty advanced in construction and the arts, especially sculpting. It was because there was a lot of marble in the Rhone kingdom. Thanks to that, the Henituse region became the fifth best marble mining region, bringing in a lot of money. Furthermore, a mountain range took up most of Count Henituse's region. Even though it was located in the northwest, the mountains were extremely fertile, allowing the residents to grow grapes in between the mountains for wine. Although there was not a large quantity of wine from these fields, it were still treated as one of the best wines in the entire continent. However, Cale's mind was filled more about the strong individuals, and not these facts. He had even missed lunch as he sat in the study thinking about that all day. Why are there so many experts on this stupid land? This isn't the Murim. There were so many hermit experts here like in the Murim. That was why Cale came to a conclusion. Do not mess with just anybody. An average-looking chef could be a poison expert, and the person working in the repair shop could be someone who viciously killed people with his wires. This was that type of land. Sigh. A deep sigh came out of Cale's mouth. He had just completed his plan to prevent himself from dying and living peacefully. Cale, who wanted to let out another sigh, turned his gaze to the source of the cautious voice. It was the deputy butler Hans. What? Should I get them to make something else? Hans held back his sigh after seeing Cale frowning and opening his eyes widely. He was thinking that Cale would now flip the table. Hans didn't know why the Count would assign him to take care of Cale, but held back his rising despair as he waited for Cale's response. And Cale did respond. Why would you remake something this delicious? Excuse me. Cale picked his fork back up and sliced the meat. Dinner was even fancier than breakfast. It was not delicious because he had never had something like this when he was still Kim Rok-soo, but because it was an extravagant taste, even for the original Cale. Kim Rok-soo didn't know how Cale grew up, but the original Cale had issues with anything that was not fancy. He liked that fact quite a bit. Everybody knew that was the case and only brought the best of the best. Cale put a piece of the well-cooked, but still juicy, piece of steak in his mouth as he asked Hans. His attitude was one that said he did not care about etiquettes at all. Hans, who made this meal? Ah, it was second chef B. Crocs. Cale suddenly lost his appetite. B. Crocs. He was clean-cut and was the son of the servant Ron. However, unlike his father, he specialized in the way of the sword and not assassinations. B. Crocs was also obsessed with cleanliness and sharpened his spotless blade every day, using that same sword to slice the heads of his enemies off their bodies. He also specializes in torture. That kind of guy ends up admiring Choi Han's sword skill and chooses to follow him. His father Ron makes a deal with Choi Han to help him, and chooses to leave with the two of them for the sake of his son. Although he may not look like it, Ron cherishes his son quite a bit. Cale looked down at the medium-rare steak that was still slightly pink on the inside and gulped a few times. I can't allow my blood to shed like this steak. He turned his gaze toward Hans, who was still looking at him before cutting another piece of steak and putting it in his mouth. It is delicious. He is Ron's son, right? I did not know he was such a talented chef. I will deliver your message to Chef B. Crocs. I'm sure he will be very happy to know that young Master Cale complimented his cooking. Is that so? Let him know that I truly enjoyed this delicious meal. Yes, sir. Hans was looking at Cale with a stiff expression, but Cale had made up his mind. He was not going to mess with B. Crocs and would work to make a good impression. Cale enjoyed the meal once again with a relaxed heart. Everything will be settled once he made B. Crocs run into Choi Han and leave the region. Cale had already made what he thought to be a pretty good plan to make that happen. Just like during breakfast, Cale completely emptied the dishes. He had a satisfied smile on his face as he got up and looked toward Hans. Hans, why did you suddenly end up being assigned to me? Hans had mentioned before dinner that his father, Ruth, had sent him to personally handle Cale's needs. Although Cale did not know about the situation in Count Henituse's family once Choi Han leaves, Hans was extremely skilled and probably had the best chance of all the deputy butlers in becoming the official butler. Hans slightly bowed his head and answered the question. The Count Nem was concerned after hearing that young master had missed a meal while working in the study and ordered me to make sure that the young master makes sure to eat every meal. As a result, I will be overseeing just the meal-related duties for the young master. To be specific, Hans was responsible for the meals. Is that so? My father did something he didn't need to do. I would eat properly on my own. But I guess I would not have realized it was time for dinner if Hans did not come tell me. Cale was busy writing down all the fateful encounters in the first 5 volumes of the novel in Korean. After leaving the dining room, Cale smiled toward Hans. Hans, take good care of me. Ah, of course. Please take good care of me as well. I will do my best. Hans stumbled a bit as he answered, but Cale just let it be. Cale saw Ron standing there as soon as he opened the door and started to frown. Ron, didn't I tell you to go eat? Cale told him to go away because he did not want to see this old man's face, but he would not leave. He just roamed around Cale like a fly. Ron had been waiting outside the door when he was in the study, but even that got on Cale's nerves. Young master, it is my duty to take care of you. Cale clicked his tongue after seeing Ron smiling at him. He then threw a bit of a tantrum. Enough. I don't need it, so go eat. Why don't you go eat even when I tell you to go eat? Don't follow me. You know my temper if you do, right? Cale threatened Ron with his gaze to reinforce that he did not want Ron to follow as he headed back to the study. When he peeked back, Ron was standing there with a stiff expression while Hans was looking towards him with shock. Should I not have thrown a tantrum? Cale was scared of the assassin old man's stiff expression and turned his head back around before speeding back to the study. The desk was completely empty. The document that he had been working so hard on to write in Korean was already burnt in the fire. Cale had done so himself. There was nobody here who knew Korean, but he had to be careful. He had also told all the servants not to enter the study without his permission as well. I remember everything anyways. Kim Rok-soo had always been good at remembering things he enjoyed. Comic books, novels, movies, no matter what it was, as long as he enjoyed it, he was able to remember the names and appearances of the characters. Of course, if he didn't like something, he would not remember anything about it at all. Cale leaned his back onto the chair and thought about what he needed to do in the future. First, I need to see Choi Han tomorrow and do that. The corners of his lips started to slowly rise. I need to pick up a shield. To live long without dying. He had no intentions of fighting. In order to achieve that goal, the first step was raising his defenses. Second was finding a recovery method. Third was being faster than anybody else. Fourth was a strength that does not hurt him but can kill others. Of course, the most important thing was to avoid the battlefield or anywhere where there may be bloodshed. Cale thought about these so-called plans of his as he slowly closed his eyes with satisfaction. He was thinking about it even as he fell asleep. At least, I will not be beaten up even when the time comes for it in the novel. The indestructible shield. Cale was thinking about this first shapeless strength he was going to get as he fell asleep. The corners of his lips that had gone up did not seem like they would ever come down. Fateful encounters did not have an owner. It was a first-come first-served type of deal. The important day. What did he need to do in order to calm his nerves and be successful? Cale thought the first step was to have a hearty breakfast. He felt like the only thing he did after coming to this world was eating, but he was going to enjoy the meal since he will be busy for a while starting tomorrow. Ahem. I heard you fell asleep in the study last night. It somehow ended up that way. He casually answered his father's question and continued to focus on the food. The fact that he did not even look at his father probably seemed rude, but it was fine since he was known for being the trash. Cale finished eating first and stood up. The screeching noise of the chair made everyone focus on him. I will head out first. It was not proper etiquette, but Cale's father Deruth just seemed to like his son no matter what. He looked back and forth at Cale and the empty plates before starting to smile. Sure. Go ahead. Thank you. Cale needed to quickly leave because he had a lot of things to do today. But Deruth held him back for a second. You don't need any allowance today. I do need some. This really was a family with a lot of money. Cale held back his smile after hearing that his father will send him the allowance through Hans and left without even saying thank you. He did make eye contact with his brother, Basin, for a moment, but Cale just ignored it and headed toward the dining room door. He saw that Ron was following him and shooed him away. Ron. I'm going out. Don't look for me. Don't look for me. That was Cale's code for letting Ron know that he was leaving the estate that was located near the rear of the city to go drinking. Whenever he did this, Ron just smiled and told him to have a safe trip. Will you not go to the study today? But for some reason, Ron asked a rare question today. Cale started to frown. Ron, I don't think that is something you need to be curious about. I understand, young master. I will be waiting for you. Cale's forehead started to show even more wrinkles after hearing that Ron will be waiting for him. Don't wait for me. Cale flicked his finger to beckon one of the servants standing at the entrance of the residence over and walked out with him. Cale still seemed angry, so that servant did not say anything as he followed behind Cale. Once he exited the residence, he could see the garden and the gate of the exit farther away. It was only then that Cale let out a sigh and peeked backwards. He could see Ron's stiff expression through the closing door. I'm glad I was able to shake him off. He was glad that Ron did not follow him. However, Cale was afraid of that stiff expression. He was an assassin after all. Cale decided that he will treat Ron better and not make him angry starting the next interaction as he exited the estate. Of course, he was on a carriage. He arrived at his destination a little bit later. Young master. Is this the right place? The driver cautiously asked as he opened the door. He then peeked toward the shop in front of him. The driver's face was clearly filled with confusion. Yes. This is it. Cale, who was wearing clothes that would be fancy to others but was the simplest thing in his closet, walked out of the carriage. Nobody was around them, as they had moved away as soon as they saw the carriage with the Count's crest on it. The fragrance of tea with poetry. It was a tea shop that allowed you to read poems while drinking tea. This clean 3-story building looked to be pretty expensive. It was true that the owner of the shop was very wealthy. In fact, as the bastard son of a concubine of a large merchant guild, he was even wealthier than Cale. The only thing was that he was living here while hiding that identity. If I recall correctly, the owner goes to the capital around Volume 3 to meet Choi Han there. It is there that he claims that, he may be a bastard son of a concubine of the merchant guild, but that he will become the owner of the merchant guild. The man who shouts and swears to Choi Han that he will become the owner of the merchant guild. Cale only read the first 5 volumes, and thus did not know if the man ever ended up becoming the owner of that merchant guild, but since he was one of the main character's partners, he probably will succeed. Cale looked toward the driver who was sweating like a hog and gave an order. You can leave now. Are you going to make me say the same thing twice? No, do I not need to wait for you, young master? Cale casually answered as he opened the door to the tea shop. Yeah. I'll be here for a while. Gulp. He could hear the driver's gulp behind him, but a much clearer and pleasurable noise filled Cale's ears. Clang. A quiet but clear bell sound announced Cale's entrance into the tea shop. Cale stood at the entrance and looked around the tea shop. It was still early, and there were not many people there. Cale could see that all of them were shocked to see him there. Well, the novel did say there was nobody in this region who did not know about Cale. He was public enemy number one for the merchants because he had a tendency to break everything in their shops. Welcome. However, the owner of this shop warmly welcomed Cale in. Cale looked toward the baby pig-like man who welcomed him in from the counter. He must be the owner. The wealthy bastard, Billows. His round face and full body definitely looked like a baby pig like the novel described. His charm was his extremely bright smile. He looks like a piggy bank. Cale took out a gold coin and put it on the counter as he ordered. I plan on staying on the third floor all day today. Billows stared at Cale with a smile on his face. Cale pretended not to notice as he pointed to the bookshelf. Any tea that is not bitter. Do you have novels here too or just poems? Clang. The sound of someone putting their teacup down rang through the shop. Cale just thought of it as someone putting the teacup down hard and looked toward Billows. He preferred novels to poems. Of course. We have a lot of novels as well, young Master Cale. Really? Then send up the most interesting book and a cup of tea. Yes. I understand. Cale's gold coin fell onto Billows's chubby hands. Cale turned away as Billows tried to give him change. I'll drink more tea later, so just keep it. But it is still too much, young master. A gold coin was worth 1 million gallon. Having that coin, that was worth 1 million Korean won, Cale did something that he had always wanted to try. I have a lot of money. Consider it as your tip. Talking about how rich you are. Who cares if Billows actually has more money than he does? He also knew about many fateful encounters that will earn him a lot of money. Cale tried to look cool as he pointed toward the tables on the first floor with his chin. Well, if it is too much, you can treat everyone here to a cup of tea on me. Golden bell. He wanted to do something like this once. After he told his father that he needed allowance, he received 3 gold coins which were worth a total of 3 million gallon. Young master, still. Ah, enough. Just bring my tea. It really was good to be the trash. Cale did not care about being respectful as he headed up to the third floor. He could hear whispers coming from behind him, but he did not need to care because there were already enough rumors about him, the trash of the Count's family. Just like I thought. There was nobody else on the third floor right now because it was early in the morning. Cale took a seat in the innermost corner of the third floor. He then looked out the window. This is the right spot. The spot where you could best see the northern gate of Western City. Cale planned to watch Choi Han from this location today. Chapter 5, They Met, 2. He gets chased away from the gate early in the morning. Choi Han headed in the direction he remembered hearing about from the villagers after he finished burying all of his beloved villagers. He was heading toward Western City. Choi Han had been transported to this world when he was a freshman in high school, but he had lived here for tens of years already. Of course, the fact that most of that life was spent trying to survive in the forest of darkness made him mature in a slightly twisted way, and, as such, he was more rational than anybody would expect after such an incident. I need to go report this to the Lord at the castle. Harris village may have been a remote village, but it was still under Count Henituse's jurisdiction. That was why Choi Han headed to Western City, hoping to at least prepare a small funeral for the villagers. He was also planning on looking for information regarding the assassins he had killed when he had lost his calm, as he was unable to ask them any questions. However, sending the dead off properly came before revenge. If you think about it, he really is an affectionate person. But losing all of the first people who showed him love after tens of years in the forest of darkness at once made it impossible for Choi Han's mind to not become twisted. In the novel, that was when Cale messes with Choi Han and touches a nerve. He remembered what the Cale in the novel said to Choi Han. "Why should my father care whether or not some useless villagers are dead? This cup of alcohol in my hand is worth more than all of your useless lives combined." Choi Han starts to laugh at Cale's words as he asks back, "What an interesting thought. I am very curious to know whether you will change your mind or not. Shall we test it out?" That test was beating Cale to a pulp so that he was almost dead. The amazing thing was that Cale never changed his mind even after he was beaten to a pulp. "Ah, I'm getting the chills." Cale started to rub his arm after seeing the goosebumps that were developing. He quickly took a sip of the tea that Billows had brought for him. He then looked out the window once again, only to get the chills right back. "It's that punk." The moment the gates opened for the morning, a young man wearing clothes with black marks everywhere, such that it made it seem like the clothes were burnt in multiple places, approached the gate. It was Choi Han. Cale did not get up from his seat as he observed Choi Han. His speed was admirable, as he ran like a lunatic through a distance that would normally take a carriage a week to travel, but, as a result, he looked like a mess. Of course, the events in the village were responsible for a bit of his messy look as well. The guard blocked Choi Han's path as he walked in with his head down, looking completely exhausted. Cale didn't know what they were saying, but he could see Choi Han shake his head at the guard's question. "I'm sure they're asking if he has any identification." The guards of Western City were generally gentle, but they were strict when it came to the rules. They replicated their liege, Count Dirutha's personality. They kicked him out. As expected, Choi Han walked back out of the gate. He did not even throw a fit. After continuously running for a day, his slightly recovered conscience told him not to kill an innocent man. Choi Han will now wait until nighttime before he stealthily jumps over the city wall to enter. He then runs into Cale, who was busy drinking away. Screech. Since Cale was alone, the sound of the chair being pushed as he stood up sounded pretty loud. He went downstairs and informed Billows, who was at the counter. "I'll be back soon. Don't clear my spot." "Yes, young master. I look forward to your return." Cale ignored the smile on Billows's chubby face as he walked out of the tea shop. He didn't break anything. Cale could hear someone's voice coming from inside the shop, but he did not care. He needed to set the foundation to earn that indestructible shield today. The indestructible shield. It is not talking about a physical item. The best comparison might be a mage's mana shield. Something that does not actually have a physical form. However, it was very different from a mana shield, as it was closer to superpower than magic. The funny thing was that the human who created the power, but ended up dying, was someone who served a god but ended up being excommunicated. All sorts of weird things are in this novel. As with the history of any fantasy world, this world also had its ancient history. During that ancient time, neither magic nor weaponry was developed. Instead, it was a society where your own innate talent or talents gathered from supernatural occurrences played a pivotal role. The strongest powers in that society were superpowers, divine powers, and natural forces. It was a very primitive time. Some of those powers have lasted all the way until now, staying hidden in certain locations or items. It was possible to take those powers for yourself if you meet the right conditions. Ancient powers. The heroes would find these powers, however, these powers were all supporting powers, not strong enough to be used as a hero's mainstay. These were the powers that Cale was looking to find. Everything but the divine powers. Whether it be God or angels or devils, Cale did not want to get involved with any of them. That was why Cale was looking for the powers that people naturally developed or came from nature. That is the way to make sure I don't need to put in any effort. Those were the types of powers he was looking for. Something like sword art or magic would require him to put in effort to practice. He didn't want to do something like that. Unlike other books, the ancient civilization in the novel, The Birth of a Hero, was not that strong. As civilization developed, the magic and summoning skills that were developed outshined the natural powers left behind by the ancient civilization. Superpowers were the same way. Most subtle superpowers would be blown away by a single hit from the aura that was used in present day. It wasn't like the heroes just used these powers sparingly for no reason. And my goal is to collect these subtle superpowers to become decently strong. It was a satisfying goal. Especially because he also knew the ancient power that could strengthen these subtle superpowers. In order to take the first step in his plan, Cale started to look for the ancient power that was hidden in Western City. He knew the requirement to earn that power. Young master. Welcome. Cale just nodded his head at the baker, who bowed so low that it looked like his head might touch the ground, to respond. Gasp. He could hear the baker gasping, but Cale pretended not to hear it. He felt bad about how his trash reputation was making this baker so fearful. Give me some bread. Cale pointed at all of the bread in the bakery and sternly responded. Everything from here to there. Clang. The gold coin that Cale took out started to spin on the counter. Pack it all up. The baker seemed to be frozen in place as Cale continued to speak. 2 or 3 more gold coins should be enough for a week's worth of bread, right? The baker's gaze, which had been on the gold coin, moved to Cale. It was too much money to pay for the bread. Cale just stoically responded to the baker's shaking eyes. I can go somewhere else if you don't want it? No, it is nothing like that. Young master. I will pack it as fast as possible. The baker was extremely respectful for a different reason than before as he moved around quickly. After a few minutes, Cale left the bakery with a bag full of bread over his shoulder. Even though it was just bread, it weighed quite a bit. The weight made Cale start to frown, and he ignored the baker who was watching him leave as he stepped into the street. Cale leisurely walked down the street, noticing that anybody who made eye contact with him would quickly turn and walk away. The majority of the people even ran away to avoid eye contact with him. It really is different than Korea. It is truly a fantasy world. Cale looked around as he wandered around this market that gave off the typical fantasy feel. MMPH. Anytime he made eye contact with a merchant, they became shocked and avoided his gaze. Tisk tisk. Cale really must have lived up to his title of trash in the past. Cale was talking shit about himself as he walked past the market and toward the western part of Western City. The slum is located to the west. No matter how wealthy a territory may be, there are always going to be poor people. In a situation like this, most people would probably expect something along these lines to happen. It is a fateful encounter that you can earn by sharing food with the poor. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Cale could feel people peeking at him as soon as he entered the slums. This was the place where both the idlest and the most vicious people lived together. Although the poor may not know the face of their liege, the count, they knew Cale's face. These people who had nothing needed to pay even closer attention to the type of person that would cause a ruckus in the market, pub, plaza, well, you name it, and Cale has probably caused a ruckus there too. Tisk. Even though they knew all these stories about Cale, they couldn't resist the sweet smell of the bread in Cale's bag. Cale just ignored all these gazes as he continued to walk. The tip of his expensive leather shoe started to become dirty from the dirty water. An unknown stench also filled Cale's nose, making him naturally start to frown. This made him start to walk even faster. The slums were on one side of a small hill and constituted of old houses. Cale was heading toward the top of that hill. As he got closer, the gazes and steps of the people following him started to lessen as well. Cale's sharp glare probably played a role in this as well. It's better here. After being freed from the stench, Cale stood at the top of the hill and turned around to look down at Western City. Of course, this hill was not as high as the Count's estate. There was no way that they would allow the lord of the territory to live somewhere that was lower than that slums. Cale came back to his senses as he headed toward a tree that was fenced off in all directions. The fence, that was made of planks the width of Cale's body, had an entrance that had rotted. It was easily broken once Cale pushed at the fence. This large tree seemed to have lasted for hundreds of years. Trees in the slums were usually chopped into firewood or had its layers peeled off to make it useless, but this tree was not like that. The reason was simple. The reason could be heard in Cale's ear. These two were the only two who had followed him until the end from the slums. You can't approach that tea tree. Cale ignored that warning. He heard another worried voice as well. You can't go there. It's a man-eating tree. A man-eating tree. Anyone who hung themselves on this tree became mummies overnight. Furthermore, any blood that lands on this tree instantly disappeared. Finally, there was only dirt around this tree. Grass, and even weeds, were nowhere to be found. This was the tree that Cale was looking for. A long time ago, during ancient times, there was a person who loved food so much that his gluttony in the place of worship got him kicked out. That person ended up starving to death. This tree is said to have grown on top of his body, and that person's grudge and strength were both in this tree. The indestructible shield that Cale was looking for was here. How primitive, mysterious, and strange was this? The majority of the ancient powers were mysterious like this. Cale took a bread out of the bag and carefully observed a hole that was the size of an adult's head. He needed to first send away the owner of that voice before starting his work. However, before Cale could even say anything, the voice was even louder this time as they could no longer see Cale from outside the fence because he crouched down. The voice was shaking quite a bit. You're going to die? Don't do it. Cale pressed his temples with his fingers. The number of people following him decreased the closer he got to the man-eating tree at the top of the hill. However, the owner of that voice continued to follow him. There are always nosy punks no matter where you go. Cale frowned as he turned his head around. When he did, he noticed a girl who seemed to be around 10 years old, holding her younger brother's hand while looking at him. Her eyes were full of concern. Seeing that Cale was frowning and staring at her, the young girl stumbled on her words and started to mumble. It's a man-eating tree. You're going to die. I won't die. Cale took 2 breads out of the bag and threw it toward the little girl. It didn't matter if it rolled on the ground because they were all individually wrapped. Take that and get lost. The young boy instantly grabbed the bread, but the young girl was still hesitating. In the end, Cale needed to use his identity. He stood up and pushed his head outside of the fence. You two don't know about Cale the trash. The young girl's face turned pale. Her younger brother just looked toward Cale before picking up the other bread for his sister and started to tug on her arm. Nuna. The young girl looked back and forth at the tree and Cale even as she was being pulled. You can't die. Cale clicked his tongue at the young girl who continued to say that, before making sure nobody else was around as he sat down underneath the tree. Nobody would be able to see what he was doing unless they came right up to the fence. Let's get started. He started by taking a loaf of bread out of the bag and putting it into that hole. His hand soon disappeared into the darkness underneath the tree, and Cale could feel a cold sensation as the bread in his hand disappeared. He felt like his whole hand might be sucked in, and quickly took it out. The darkness in the hole underneath the tree was still the same. If you die with a grudge, you have to resolve that grudge. This man-eating tree wasn't actually a man-eating tree. It was a tree that would eat anything. It was the side effect of the power that was left behind by the person who starved to death. But for such a thing to be related to an ancient strength, it was comical, but made it seem more realistic. I remember it said I need to feed it until the darkness disappears. The darkness in the hole underneath the tree was not the result of shade. It was darkness formed by the grudge. This could not be done with other people. One person had to continue to provide a large amount of food until the darkness disappeared. Once the darkness finally disappears, the light that was hiding underneath would appear. Once he eats that light, the indestructible shield will become callous. Eat all you want. Cale put the opening of the bag into the hole and emptied all of the bread into it. In a normal situation, that small hole should have become filled with bread, however, only the darkness continued to remain once Cale removed the bag. I guess I'll need about 10 more large bags. The darkness in the hole was slightly fainter than before. 10 bags. Only someone like Cale, with 3 million gallons as allowance, could casually say such a thing. Rumble. An odd cry seemed to resonate from the tree. It seemed to be saying that it was hungry and asking for more food. Cale felt like the darkness might suddenly reach out and grab him. It is a bit scary. Cale quickly got up. He felt like he should not be here for a long time. Just what can a stupid grudge do? Gluttony was a scary thing. I'll come back tomorrow. Cale said goodbye to the rumbling tree as if it was a person and exited the fenced area. Cale noticed the siblings eating the bread as soon as he entered the slums. For someone who was claiming that he should not go there because it was a man-eating tree, they seemed to be enjoying the breads. They must be liking the flavor, because both of them seemed very happy. My. Cale snorted at the siblings before ignoring their gazes. However, their gazes were not on him, but on the bag that was filled with bread earlier but was now empty. They were probably curious. But what could they do? They couldn't do anything. These children were probably too scared to even go near the man-eating tree. However, it is always good to be on the safe side. It would be bad if they went up to the tree and put their head into the hole and got eaten. The children of the slums have no fear. It was because they treasured a single grain of rice more than a blade coming their way. Death is always around them, so they do not fear death. They fear being hungry more than death. It was something that was written in the birth of a hero. That was why Cale decided to speak to the pair of siblings. If you want to eat bread again tomorrow, don't say a thing. The two siblings did not say anything. They were immediately following Cale's order. The young girl, who seemed hesitant earlier, put her hand on her brother's mouth and pretended to not see Cale. Cale smiled and thought that she was pretty smart, as he quickly left the slums. The people in the slums who knew Cale had gone to the top of the hill were looking at him wondering what crazy thing he was doing now, but Cale liked that kind of gaze. The people outside the slums looked at Cale weirdly as well, but Cale didn't care about these gazes. Ah, young master. You are back. Once Cale returned to the tea shop, Billows greeted him pretty happily. Yes. Bring me a new cup of tea. A refreshing one this time. Cale headed back to his seat on the third floor. It should have been pretty busy at this time, but there was nobody else on the third floor. They were all avoiding the trash of the Count's family. That was why Cale could relax. Here is your tea, young master. I also brought up some desserts. Ah, great. Thanks. Cale only continued to look toward the city gate as he took a sip of the tea. Billows observed Cale's face with an odd expression before he quietly left the third floor. It was weird to hear Cale thanking someone. Cale continued to order tea and desserts as he looked outside the window until the sky slowly turned orange and the sun set. He only got up when night arrived and it was dark outside. It was now time to go interact with the dangerous dude who will come from outside the wall. Chapter 6, They Met, 3. When does a person get more angry? Is it when they get hit by a strong straight or when they are hit 5 or 6 times by annoying jabs? It is, Of course, the latter. Cale threw 5 jabs before he was hit. Which means, 1 jab should be okay. Are you heading out? There were not many people left in the tea shop. It was past 9 p.m. This was the time when there were more people in the bars than tea shops. Since this was the time that the people mining in the pits went to drink, the bar should be full of people. I look forward to your next visit, young master. Cale nodded his head at Billows's statement. The tea was great. Cale shared his observations with Billows. And the book was good even though I only got through half of it. I especially liked the main character whose abilities are appreciated and the way he grows. In that instant, the corner of Billows's eyebrows frowned for a moment before returning to normal. His eyes were cloudy as he observed Cale. However, Cale did not notice, as he was trying to remember the contents of the book. He was too worried about Choi Han that he did not pay too much attention to it. However, it was still fun to read while having this sense of urgency in his heart. It might be an auto setting from possessing the original callous body, but Cale was able to understand the language of this world, and had no issues reading and enjoying the book. A smile formed on Cale's face as he continued to speak to Billows, who was standing there with a blank expression on his face. Don't let anyone else read that book so that I can read it whenever I come. This truly was the immature son of the Count, who was trying to monopolize someone else's property. Billows, the bastard son of a wealthy merchant guild, might not like it, but what could he do? Cale was the son of the Count. Yes. I will reserve this book only for young Master Cale. However, Billows's response was different from what Cale expected. Billows smiled brightly as he urged Cale to come back soon. Please come again soon. I will be waiting for you. Cale didn't want to go, but had to leave to go meet Choi Han. Ring. The bell rang once more and it suddenly felt like the tea shop became louder once Cale left. However, it was even louder outside the tea shop than it was inside. Even though this territory was far from the capital, the fact that a lot of artists resided here and that they had a special product made it a popular location. These individuals, as well as the miners who were looking to relax after a long day in the mines, all were out late to drink. Cale walked that street alone. If you think about it, he really is a unique person. Normally in fantasies or martial arts novels, the trash of the family tend to hang out with the gangsters or bad crowds. They drink, fool around with women, and cause a ruckus on the streets or stores. The funny thing was that Cale Henituse actually hated gangsters and scammers. In fact, he despised them. He thought that they were all scumbags. The worst of all scumbags. It was better to at least be the citizens who worked hard even though there was no hopes for a better future. That was why he never beat people up when he was drunk but had no issues throwing things at the gangsters he saw. Well, attempted to throw things, since his aim when drunk was terrible. Maybe that was the reason. Ego, young master, you're here. The owner of the bar was extremely afraid of Cale. It was because of that one day when Cale broke pretty much everything around where he was sitting to drink. In fact, Cale was probably number 1 on the blacklist for Western City bars. He did not respond to the owner's greeting and just threw a gold coin at him. Bring a bottle of my usual. Oh, and roasted chicken breast. Don't put salt on it. Excuse me? Why, you don't want to find a seat first? Cale started to frown. The owner immediately waved his hands and bowed his head. Immediately. I will bring it immediately. The owner was moving quickly, but it looked like he was smiling. It was because it looked like Cale was not planning on sitting down. Cale looked around the bar that became quiet once he walked in. Everyone was avoiding his gaze and turned their heads. It was like they were wondering why he had to choose this bar of all bars in the city. The gangsters and scammers in the bar were all extremely nervous right now. The sound of Cale clicking his tongue could be heard through the silence in the bar. Young master, here is the bottle you requested. Cale grabbed the bottle and bag of chicken. It was the alcohol he drank often. It was probably the most expensive alcohol in this bar. He accepted the bottle with no regret and left the bar. Cale immediately opened the bottle and drank about half of it as soon as he stepped out of the bar. Oh! The alcohol tasted pretty good. Since Cale had a high tolerance to alcohol, it did not affect him at all to drink half of the bottle at once. He just flushed easily, making people think he was a lightweight. Cale quickly walked along with the bottle in his hand. He walked back past the tea shop he stayed in all day until he saw the guards stiffen up after seeing him. Seeing them acting like that made him want to go out of the gate, but unfortunately, that was not his destination. Ah, I'm starting to get hot. Cale felt himself heating up as he continued to drink. He walked a bit further until he reached the city wall not too far away. The tall city wall that started at the gate seemed to defend against any potential intruders. Well, it depends on the person. Cale recalled the information from the book. Approximately 100 steps from the city gate. That was the location where Choi Han jumped over the city wall. Cale clenched the bottle in his hand as he quickly ran toward the location. There were not many people on the streets because it was the residential area. Cale took a deep breath once he arrived at the calculated location. Exactly 100 steps away from the city gate. It was a corner of the residential area, so there wasn't any other light other than the torch the guards put on top of the wall, as well as the lights coming out of the residential windows. But that was enough light. Cale slowly approached his destination after letting his eyes adjust to the dark. Just as I expected. He could see something curled up underneath the city wall. Actually, there were multiple things. Delicate-looking things that were shaking because of the cold. Cale continued to walk toward the location. He could hear the voices of the curled-up life forms. Meow meow. 2 cats were meowing as they lay curled up underneath the city wall. Cale started to smile. It's right here. He found the right spot. The moment Choi Han jumps over the wall, a baby kitten is body slammed by the alpha cat of the neighborhood and gets sent tumbling to the city wall. Choi Han quickly twists his body to avoid landing on the kitten. This was a world where coincidences played a big role. He really is a good guy. Choi Han twists his ankle after unexpectedly twisting his body to avoid hurting the kitten. He had run like crazy to reach Western City after killing tens of people for the first time and burying the corpses of the villagers. His body had reached its limit, making him unable to land properly after making such a movement. Meow meow. Cale gazed at the kitten that was curled up and shaking, as well as the other kitten that seemed to be its sibling licking the shaking kitten. He then turned his gaze. He turned to look at one of the alleys that was close to where was standing. He could see him. I found him. The man who was wincing in pain while looking like one of the homeless that lived in the slums. Cale could see the shaggy black hair and the old and burnt clothes. According to the novel, Cale and Choi Han would meet tomorrow. Tonight was the night Cale got drunk and got the scar on his side. Things were already different than in the novel, even though it was just minor details. Cale stood up as he had crouched down to look at the kittens. Choi Han must have felt his gaze from a few moments ago, as Choi Han slowly raised his head and his eyes focused on Cale through his shaggy black hair. Damn it, I'm shaking. Cale could hear his heart going crazy. Although it was too dark to see clearly, Choi Han's eyes that Cale could see through his hair were extremely cold. Cale thought that it was a good idea that he chose to drink. Cale congratulated himself for making such a smart decision and calmed himself down as much as possible. Jab. He needed to launch a jab and leave a good first impression. Cale took a deep breath as he started to speak to Choi Han, who was staring at him. You look like you are hungry. Tisk tisk. Cale clicked his tongue and took the chicken breast out of the bag. Then with an extremely gentle movement, Cale offered the roasted chicken breast not to Choi Han, but to the kittens. You poor things. Go ahead and eat it. Cale didn't know that the kittens would be this small. He hoped that they could still eat the chicken breast. Tisk. He clicked his tongue as he ripped the chicken breast into pieces so that the kittens could eat it better. He was wondering what the hell he was doing crouching here feeding these kittens. To be honest, Cale did not like cats. However, Choi Han treasured small animals. Gruol. Gruol. The injured kitten must have understood Cale's dislike for cats, as it showed its teeth and started to growl, but Cale started to pet the kitten's silver fur as he looked into its golden eyes. The kitten must not have liked it, as it did its best to avoid Cale's hand. "You poor things. Eat this and get better soon." He didn't even look at Choi Han when he said that, however, he was thinking that Choi Han was definitely looking at him. "Do you have somewhere to go?" He did not hear a response. However, Cale continued to speak. The guards would soon come to patrol this area, and he needed to make a move before Choi Han started to limp away to avoid the guards. Or a place to stay. Cale petted the growling silver-furred kitten with golden eyes and pushed away the red kitten that was trying to attack him as he asked. The red kitten kept trying to hit Cale for some reason. Its golden eyes, that matched its siblings' eyes, shined brightly even in the darkness. But Cale needed to focus on Choi Han. "Are you hungry?" There still was no response. Cale had expected this. Choi Han was probably observing him right now, but he also probably wanted to rest. Both his body and mind had reached their limit. In addition, he had received a huge shock just the other day. For someone like Choi Han who had lived on his own without any human contact other than the villagers of that small village, Western City was completely foreign to him. He may have lived for tens of years already, but he was still young. "Are you not going to say anything? Why are you talking to me?" Choi Han finally seemed to have decided that Cale was weak. Cale was weak enough that he could easily kill him even though he was at his limits. That was why Choi Han felt that it would be okay to accept Cale's goodwill even though he had no idea why Cale was being nice to him. Cale stood up and walked toward Choi Han. The guards would soon come patrolling through this location. Hey! He could see Choi Han's situation better once he got closer. He was a mess. However, maybe it was because he was the main character, but his eyes were clear. The black hair and black pupils that showed that Choi Han was Korean were actually quite nice to see. That was why Cale smiled as he casually spoke to Choi Han. "Follow me. I'll feed you." The best first impression was to be the one who provides delicious food. Chapter 7, They Met, 4. Choi Han stopped leaning against the wall and pushed his body up. His body was leaning to his left probably because his right ankle was uncomfortable, but Cale did not help him or say anything about him. There was no reason to be any nicer to him than he had already been. Cale told Choi Han to follow him as he headed toward the Count's estate. However, an existence blocked his path. "Mia." The red-furred golden-eyed kitten ran toward Cale and rubbed its cheeks on Cale's shoes. Cale started to frown. He didn't like cats, but this one seemed pretty cute. However, he suddenly felt chills all over his body and turned around. Choi Han was staring at him. "Damn it." Cale awkwardly started to pet the kitten. "It seems like it likes me. But I have to go. See you next time." Cale never understood why people talk to animals. However, Cale, who had now become that person that was speaking to animals, quickly stood back up and walked away from the kitten. "Gruol." The silver-furred golden-eyed kitten growled as if it was telling the red-furred kitten to come back while telling Cale to get lost. The red-furred kitten seemed to not want to go back as it continued to look back at Cale as it walked away. However, Cale did not turn back. "Meow, meow." The sad cries of the kittens were getting farther away. Cale took a peek backwards. Choi Han was limping, but keeping up with him. They made eye contact once more. Cale flinched as he quickly turned his head back. He was walking slowly to make it easier for Choi Han to keep up. They passed the residential area and Cale took another sip of the alcohol. The bars. Market. Plaza. They then passed the residences of the wealthy and finally arrived at the Count's estate located in the rear of the city. What are you doing? Cale looked toward Choi Han, who had stopped moving. Choi Han must have seen how the soldiers greeted Cale, as well as how the citizens avoided him, on their way here. Choi Han was probably questioning whether it really would be easy to kill Cale. Cale asked once more. Are you not going to come? As expected, Choi Han resumed walking. His reason for following Cale now was probably to get some information as well as to host the funeral for the villagers of Harris village. Why, young master? As soon as Cale stood at the main entrance of the estate, the guards and knights stumbled over their words as they greeted him. Sigh. I wish they would stop with that why, young master business. It was odd hearing them stumbling over their words every time. Since he possessed the body of a trash, he was trying his best to act like one. It was easier to be a trash young master than a noble young master. He was trying to make his life as easy as possible. Cale frowned at the guards' stumbling of words while the guards quickly opened the gate. Please head on in. Cale turned back to look at Choi Han. The rest of them looked at Choi Han as well. They were probably curious about this beggar that followed their young master back. The knights observed Choi Han with suspicion in their eyes. Follow me. Choi Han should know of Cale's status by now. He continued to limp as he approached Cale. Cale looked calm and turned back as soon as he saw that Choi Han was behind him and entered through the gate. But his heart was going crazy. I'm sure he's thinking about taking me as a hostage if something dangerous happens. That is probably why he stood right behind me. He was sure that Choi Han would not kill him. However, just thinking about being taken as hostage caused serious mental strain that Cale frowned as he looked at the two knights who were following them. Don't follow me. The knights flinched at Cale's clear order. They looked back and forth between Cale and Choi Han before one of the knights approached Choi Han and Cale with a stiff expression on his face. The knights cared about their creed more than anything else. It was fitting of the knights that Diruth treasured. Well, I guess they have to act like this to be good knights. Cale was satisfied at the knight's response to this beggar-like foreigner and left the knight alone to follow them. He just led Choi Han to the entrance of the Count's residence. Young master, you're back. Yes, Ron. This scary old man. He had been waiting for Cale outside the door. Cale didn't expect him to really be waiting. Cale was scared, but thought that it was actually for the better. Ron's gaze turned toward Choi Han, and his benign smile suddenly stiffened. Ron should be at a level where he can estimate Choi Han's strength. Choi Han also stared back at Ron. Cale didn't care what kind of attacks they were sending each other through their eyes and did what he needed to do. He was not done just yet. Cale called out to Choi Han once more and started to walk. The servant, Ron, quickly followed Cale. Young master, what is going on? I will take care of this guest if you tell me what is needed. No need. Someone else approached Cale as Ron was speaking. Young master. You returned after drinking today. It was the deputy butler Hans. Ah, he was responsible for me. Cale clicked his tongue and ignored Hans's statement. Instead, he lifted up the alcohol bottle and pointed toward Hans. It was at that moment. Ayuk. Hans covered his face with both of his arms as he curled up. Silence filled the air. Cale clicked his tongue and Hans looked up with a face completely red from embarrassment as he looked back at Cale. Put this away. Hans received the alcohol bottle from Cale with a blank expression on his face. I will actually throw it at you next time. Hans turned pale at Cale's words. Cale did not seem to care at all as he continued to walk. With the inclusion of Hans, there were now a total of 4 people following him. Cale peeked every so often to make sure they were following him properly and arrived at his destination. Kitchen number 2. Cale pushed the door open as soon as he saw the sign. He could hear Hans's confused voice behind him. However, there was a thick smile on Cale's face. The end was near. Now, B. Crocs and Choi Han will meet. Cale's heart was beating fast. The door easily opened. Cale's expression stiffened at the scene in front of him inside the door. Clang. Clang. Second Chef B. Crocs was smiling while sharpening his blade. He seemed to be enjoying himself while sharpening his blade all alone in kitchen number 2. However, that smile disappeared as soon as he saw Cale. That was why Cale was scared. It was always scary to deal with lunatics. You never knew what crazy things a lunatic would do. Cale made a move before B. Crocs could respond. He put a hand on Choi Han's shoulder and pointed at him. Give him something to eat? B. Crocs asked with a stiff expression on his face. The sharp blade in his hand was shining as it reflected the light. Cale calmed his shaking heart as he said it once more. Give him something to eat? He's hungry. Ho! The knight let out a shocked noise from the back, but Cale did not have the time to pay attention to that right now. He waited for B. Crocs's response with anxiety. Finally, B. Crocs answered with a stiff expression still on his face. I will do as you instructed, young master. It was done. B. Crocs and Choi Han. And even Ron, someone that he did not expect. The three of them were connected now. A bright smile formed on Cale's face. He could finally relax as he gave B. Crocs another order with a slightly higher tone. Also prepare something for me. I'm hungry. Cale thought about the steak from last night's dinner. Your steak last night was the best. You are a great chef. The tip of B. Crocs's knife slightly shook. Something like that steak would be a wonderful meal. Prepare it quickly. Cale turned around without waiting for B. Crocs's response. He then left the kitchen and headed towards his chamber. The knight and Hans followed him, and Hans quickly asked. What should I do about that guest? I guess he is my guest. You take care of it. Since he connected the three of them, he didn't want to deal with anything else for today. B. Crocs and Ron should be able to tell Choi Han's strength. In the novel, B. Crocs originally swears his loyalty to Choi Han because of his strength, so he should pledge his loyalty after figuring out Choi Han's strength this time too. Of course, Cale had some other plans in the case that B. Crocs was unable to determine Choi Han's strength. All Cale had to do was make Choi Han beat someone or something up, without it being him. Oh, and B. Crocs had to be there to watch. Even if it might have some holes, Cale had thought about a lot of different things. Hans. Stop annoying me and just bring the meal over to my chamber when it's ready. As expected, Ron did not follow him. Cale left the knight and Hans outside his chamber door as he closed the door and laid down on the bed. He was happy. His exhaustion and the alcohol made him fall asleep before the food ever showed up. That was why he did not know that B. Crocs's cooking knife slashed toward Choi Han's neck and that Ron's sharp dagger was flung toward Choi Han's heart. Of course, both of their attacks had failed. Well, this was actually a situation that nobody, other than the three involved individuals, would know about. Chapter 8, Picked It Up, 1. Late at night. Deputy Butler Hans had to stand in front of Count de Ruth. He started to make his report while de Ruth quietly listened until he was finished. He is currently sleeping in his room. Hans finally finished his report and de Ruth started to speak. The driver reported that he went to the Flynn Merchant Guild's illegitimate son's tea shop. Today, he brought a young man whose identity we cannot verify. In terms of drinking, he only drank a little bit and kept a clear head. Hans's report was short, but de Ruth found that short report interesting. Should we put a tail on him? He waved his hand to oppose Hans's question. He didn't want to know what his son was doing on the outside to the point he would put a tail on him. No need. As long as he is in the city, anything he does is under my authority to handle. De Ruth cherished Hans the most out of all the young deputy butlers. It was because he fulfilled orders well and was a good person. Do what you have been doing in terms of observing Cale inside the house and reporting what you see. I understand. Hans did not say anything else as he bowed his head. Dear Ruth. He was someone who did not have any special abilities nor any solid networks. However, just like the previous count, he was able to rule over the Henituse territory and grow his wealth by selling marble and wine. He was someone who was able to protect his territory properly. Cale has changed. Cale felt different than normal. It wasn't that he suddenly got smarter or stronger, but that his actions were clearly different from before. Ah, Hans. Yes, Count Nim. Bring me some information about the Flynn Merchant Guild. Tea shop owner, Billows. Ruth knew about this bastard son of the Flynn Merchant Guild. This was because the Henituse's largest trading partner for wine was the Flynn Merchant Guild. I will get right on it. Ruth watched Hans walk out of his office as he started to think. There was a lot of things for him to think about other than the change in Cale's demeanor. The atmosphere around the continent was dangerous. It was like a volcano right before it erupts. Ruth could clearly feel the dangerous atmosphere despite the fact that he was in the corner of the kingdom. It was because he was always receiving an endless amount of information about it. But the message from the imperial court that he received today made Ruth even more certain about the current atmosphere of the continent. The former counts of the Henituse territory always passed on a single piece of advice to the next in power. There is no need to be recorded in history. Just live for peace and happiness. I guess I need to reinforce the city walls. He may not be a good fighter, but Ruth was always thinking about ways to protect himself and his family. There are times when the body is stronger than the mind. Young master, you were sleeping so soundly that I did not wake you up. Cale had slept in. The fact that Ron brought lemonade instead of cold water again made things even worse. However, Cale could not say anything about it. It was because there was a bandage around Ron's neck. Are you hurt? Are you worrying about me? No. It's just annoying to look at. It is nothing much. I was just scratched by a cat's claw. Is a cat another reference to an innocent person? Cale was sure that someone would have had their fated meeting last night. He avoided the gaze of Ron, who was smiling, and headed toward the chamber's window. He needed to move faster because he slept in. Will you be heading out right away? Yes. I'll take care of everything on my own outside. I understand. Oh, young master. Cale let go of the door handle and turned to look at Ron. Ron had an odd smile on his face. What do you think about the lemonade? Great. It's delicious. Ron's voice became an octave lower. Is that so? What kind of question was that? Since Ron was someone he could not ignore, Cale just answered the question as nicely as possible while opening the door. Slam. He then quickly closed it right back. Ron approached Cale at his calling and whispered with a smile on his face. Young master, were you surprised? Your guest from yesterday is waiting for you outside. Cale was surprised. Cale had seen Choi Han staring at him as soon as he opened the door, which caused him to close the door in shock. His hand headed to the inner pocket of his shirt. The 10 million gallons in his pocket calmed him down. Ron gazed toward Cale as he continued to speak. I didn't have a chance to tell you because you opened the door right away. I told him to wait comfortably in his room, but he insisted that he needed to see you and waited outside the door. Didn't have a chance to tell me my ass. Cale could not say anything to this terrible old man who definitely had the chance but chose not to tell him. Cale moved a step away from Ron as he opened the door again. What's going on? Cale pretended like he never slammed the door as he started to chat with Choi Han. He was paying attention to Choi Han's appearance as he asked. After taking a shower, fixing his hair, and wearing new clothes, a pure and clean feeling was coming from Choi Han. However, it was difficult to think like that after seeing his eyes. Choi Han was still in a twisted state. That was why looking at his eyes made Cale feel a bit scared. Choi Han was also staring back at Cale before finally starting to speak. Pay you back. I will pay you back for the meal. Choi Han was speaking formally, unlike yesterday. More importantly, Cale started to frown at the words, pay you back. Pay me back. Is he trying to make me have a heart attack? Who in their right mind would use Choi Han for manual labor? Cale just wanted Choi Han to get out of the city as soon as possible. Of course, Choi Han would agree to help Cale out if he said it was to pay him back. He was that kind of person. However, Cale didn't have anything he needed from Choi Han. No need. Is there anything else you need? He quickly rejected Choi Han's offer and asked if there was anything else he needed. Choi Han started to observe Cale even more closely. That gaze made Cale think about how Cale got beaten to a pulp in the novel, and his arms started to develop goosebumps. Choi Han started to speak at that point. There is something I would like to request for your help. Cale closed his eyes at the word, help. He did not want to get involved with Choi Han. The help that Choi Han would ask about could be nothing other than something regarding Harris Village. The Cale in the novel called the villagers of Harris Village useless and ended up getting beaten up because of it. Cale thought about that as he opened his mouth. Tell Hans your request. He will take care of everything. After opening his eyes again, Cale made eye contact with Choi Han, who was standing there as still as a statue. He is a talented deputy butler. He will be able to help you out with almost any normal request. Cale then put a hand on Ron's shoulder. He could feel Ron flinch, but Cale decided to get both of them out of his sight at the same time. Ron here is pretty useful as well. He will als